He never speaks. Not about rumors, not about rivals, and never, ever about other stars. But now at 73, George Strait just shattered that silence. And he did it for one reason. Toby Keith. This wasn't a press tour. It wasn't a promo. It was something real and raw. Because what George said, it didn't just surprise people. It stopped the country music world cold. You've got two legends cut from opposite cloth. One, the silent cowboy. The other, a fire starter with a rebel's soul. They were never meant to collide. But what George confessed about Toby, about the battles he fought, the fire he carried, and the mark he left behind, is sending shockwaves through every honky-tonk and headline in America. This wasn't a tribute. It was a revelation. A moment so rare, so stripped down, it cracked open the stoic shell of a man who said more with silence than most ever say with songs. And when you hear what George really said, his voice trembling, his truth finally unleashed, you'll understand. This wasn't just about Toby. It was about legacy, pain, brotherhood, and the one thing George Strait never gives away, his heart. Because when the king speaks, you listen. And what he said might just rewrite everything you thought you knew. Country music has its giants, but only a few ever walk their path with soul-deep conviction. George Strait and Toby Keith, they were two of them. On paper, they couldn't have been more different. George was the silent storm, a man who didn't need to speak to be heard. He didn't chase fame, he didn't stir up noise. And yet, with over 60 #1 hits, he owned the stage with nothing but a steady voice and an even steadier heart. No scandals, no drama, just timeless music, a low-cocked hat, and a legacy built on quiet power. Toby roared. He didn't just enter country music, he blasted through it like a thunderclap. Loud, unfiltered, unapologetically American. His voice hit like a shot of whiskey, and his lyrics, they punched, they provoked. They stirred something primal in fans and critics alike. He didn't care if you disagreed. He dared you to feel something. While George built his legacy slow and steady, Toby lit his match and watched the sky burn. One played chess. The other, wild poker with the chips all in. But here's what no one saw coming. Behind all that contrast, there was a bond. Not in headlines, not in duets, but in the kind of mutual respect forged only between men who refused to sell out. They didn't play the industry game, they broke it. Both stood firm in who they were, true to their roots, unmoved by trends, unmolded by Nashville's machine. And George Strait, he noticed, quietly, always watching. He saw a rebel, but also a reflection. A man who carried the same invisible weight, the burden of being real in a business built on image. A man who never begged to be understood, just heard. So when George finally spoke up at 73 years old and shared what Toby Keith meant to him, it wasn't for press, it wasn't for attention, it was for truth. Because in the end, George saw what so many missed. Toby wasn't just loud, he was loyal. He wasn't just bold, he was brave. And most of all, he was authentic. In a world full of noise, they both stood their ground in silence, until now. Because when a legend like George Strait breaks his silence, you listen. And you remember, legends recognize legends, even without saying a word. They never shared a tour bus. They didn't duet on radio singles or pose arm in arm on red carpets. But behind the scenes, far from the headlines and the noise, George Strait and Toby Keith crossed paths more often than fans ever realized. Award shows, industry dinners, charity galas where even the most private legends showed face. And in those tucked-away corners, in the hush behind the curtains, George saw something most of the world missed. He saw the man behind the myth. Toby Keith, the loud, flag-waving fire starter. The guy who could bring a stadium to its feet with a single verse and a smirk. But backstage, he was different. George saw a man who shook the hands of roadies before the execs, who thanked the crew before taking the spotlight, who showed up for causes without a camera in sight. Not because it was good press, but because it was the right thing to do. He wasn't just bold on stage, he was generous of it. He was the guy who didn't have to help the next artist up, but did. Who didn't need to stay late, but always did. And George noticed, not because Toby broadcast it, but because he didn't. It was in the in-between moments that character is revealed. In the hallway glances before award shows, in the quiet nods between two veterans who knew the grind, in the shared silence between men who'd seen the highs and the cost. George remembered the swagger, sure. The laugh that could fill a room. But what stayed with him was the consistency. the realness. Toby didn't perform off stage. He didn't posture or play pretend. He just showed up, as he was, every single time. And in a business where masks are common and authenticity is currency, Toby Keith was the rarest kind of rich. So when George finally broke the silence and spoke from the heart, you could hear it in every word. Respect, admiration, and something deeper. Because what George witnessed behind the scenes all those years ago would take on an entirely new meaning when Toby faced his greatest battle. Not in a song, not in a stadium, but in the fight of his life. And this time, George wasn't watching from the wings. He was speaking from the soul. When the world found out Toby Keith had stomach cancer, it didn't feel real. How could it? This was Toby, the rowdy, fearless outlaw who never backed down from a fight, the one who'd stared down critics, crushed charts, and lit up arenas with nothing but grit and a six-string swagger. But now, he was facing something no song could soften. And still, he didn't flinch. No public breakdown, no flood of social media updates, no tearful interviews begging for sympathy. Instead, Toby did what he'd always done. He showed up, he kept writing, kept performing, kept giving everything he had to the fans who'd stood by him through every anthem and every headline. Even as the weight dropped, even as the color faded, even as the toll of the fight became impossible to hide, Toby never asked for pity. He asked for a mic. And somewhere in the background, far from the cameras and the chaos, George Strait was watching. Quiet, steady, intent. He saw something the tabloids couldn't capture, a man who wouldn't be defined by a diagnosis. Most people, faced with that kind of storm, retreat. Toby, he roared through it. And George felt that, because he knew what it was like to carry pain no one could see, to keep singing when your heart was breaking, to put on the hat, step into the light, and pretend everything was fine, because that's what legends do. But watching Toby walk that line, that hit different. It wasn't just courage, it was character. George called it a rare kind of heart, the kind that doesn't need the spotlight, but still shines, the kind that gives, even when it's got nothing left, the kind that sings through the hurt, not for glory, but for truth. Behind the scenes, there were nights no one saw, nights when Toby should have stayed home, but didn't, when the pain was heavy, but he still took the stage, when his voice cracked, but he finished the song anyway. That's the stuff you don't teach. That's the kind of strength money can't buy. And that's what George Strait will never forget. Because in those final chapters, Toby wasn't just fighting cancer. He was fighting to stay Toby. And that's not just brave. That's legendary. To the critics, Toby Keith was always too much, too loud, too proud, too damn unapologetic. But to millions of Americans, he was everything they'd been waiting for. A voice that didn't flinch, didn't filter, didn't ask for permission. He sang it how he saw it, raw, real, and with his chest out. And George Strait? The quiet king. The traditionalist, the man who built his legacy on restraint and timeless class, could have turned away, could have written Toby off as too wild, too political, too far from Nashville's old-school playbook. But he didn't, because George saw it, felt it, understood it. Toby wasn't just making noise, he was making impact. He didn't just top charts, he shifted the soul of country music. Yeah, the hits were undeniable. Should have been a cowboy, American soldier, courtesy of the red, white, and blue. But those songs weren't just catchy hooks. They were battle cries. They gave a voice to the unseen, the working class, the overlooked, the ones who loved this country so much it hurt. Where others played it safe, Toby aimed for the gut. And George respected the hell out of that. Because he knew what it meant to carry people's stories in your lyrics. To sing the truth, even when it wasn't popular. To take the stage not just as a performer, but as a messenger. That takes guts. That takes grit. That takes heart. George put it plain. Country music's got room for all of us. Cowboys, rebels, poets, and patriots. Because real country? It was never meant to fit in a box. It was born from the back roads, from pain and pride, from rebellion and redemption. And whether it came in a soft Texas drawl or a thunderous Oklahoma roar, it all came from the same place, truth. That's what George admired most. Toby shook the system, and the system needed shaking. He made people uncomfortable. He made them pay attention, and more than anything else, he made them feel. And for George Strait, a man who rarely speaks unless it matters, that's what real country music is all about. But the moment that stopped fans cold, the one no one saw coming, was when George stopped looking outward and turned inward. George Strait rarely lets you in. For decades, he's kept his heart tucked behind a calm stare and a low-brimmed Stetson. His emotions lived in the music, and only the music. But when he spoke about Toby Keith, something broke through. Not just his voice, though it cracked. Not just his composure, though it slipped, but his armor. And in that one moment, we weren't watching a country legend. We were watching a man. A man who's outlived the people he once stood shoulder to shoulder with. A man who's quietly watched the faces he came up with fade into memory. You get to a point, George said, his voice low and heavy, where you start looking back more than you look ahead. That wasn't a quote. That was a confession. And suddenly, it wasn't just about Toby anymore. It was about time. It was about loss. It was about what and who you carry with you when the spotlight starts to dim. George didn't just speak Toby's name with reverence. He mourned the space he left behind, the weight of his absence. Because even with all their differences, George saw something in Toby that felt familiar. The burden of blazing your own trail, the loneliness that hides behind fame, the quiet ache of always doing it your way, even when it costs you. He called Toby resilient, gracious, a man who never wanted pity, just a chance to make people feel. But what hit hardest wasn't what George said about Toby, it was what he revealed about himself. For a man who made a career out of keeping it all in, this was the crack in the dam. The moment when decades of silence gave way to something real. Behind the number ones, behind the record-breaking tours, behind the cowboy cool, was a man who'd buried heartbreak, who'd outlasted eras, who'd watched the world change and kept his pain off the record. Until now. And when he finally let that grief rise, even for a second, the entire country music world held its breath. Because sometimes the quietest men carry the heaviest grief. And George Strait, he's carried it long enough. But the most personal part of his story, the part no one saw coming, was still waiting to be told. Long before George Strait ever spoke Toby Keith's name in tribute, he learned what it meant to grieve in silence. June 25th, 1986, a date etched into his soul. The day everything changed. The day his 13-year-old daughter Jennifer was killed in a car crash in San Marcos, Texas. No warning, no time to say goodbye, just a phone call. And then a silence so loud it never left him. For most people, grief is something you share. You cry together. You talk it out. You lean on the people around you. But George locked it away. He vanished from the press, stopped doing interviews, never spoke about it publicly again. And from that day forward, the world would only know what he felt through the music. Because that's what George Strait does. He bleeds between the lines. He mourns between the melodies. Behind the crisp hat and calm voice was a father carrying the kind of heartbreak that never fully heals. And it's why his voice always carried that stillness, that weight, that soul. Even when he didn't say much, you felt everything. So years later, when George saw Toby Keith battling cancer with the same quiet courage, it hit differently. Because Toby didn't make a spectacle of his pain, he didn't ask for pity. He just kept showing up, kept singing, kept living on his own terms for as long as his body would let him. And George saw it, not just as a fellow artist, but as a man who knew what it meant to carry something that heavy. Grief recognizes grief. Pain recognizes pain. And in Toby, George saw a mirror, a man choosing dignity over drama, purpose over pity, music over everything. That's why George's tribute wasn't about fan service. It wasn't industry obligation. It was personal. It was real. It was one man who had carried a silent wound for decades, recognizing another soul doing the same. And maybe, just maybe, that's what finally broke his silence. Not the headlines, not the pressure, not even the legacy, but the echo. Because sometimes your pain recognizes itself in someone else's story, and when it does, you don't stay silent anymore. They came from opposite sides of the country music map. George Strait, the quiet king, the standard-bearer of tradition. Toby Keith, the loud rebel, the firebrand patriot with a guitar and something to say. One stood still. The other stirred the storm. And yet, when the dust settles, when the spotlight fades, when the radio finally goes quiet, they'll be remembered for the same damn thing. They never sold out. They didn't bend to the trends, didn't chase fame. Didn't care if the suits in Nashville clapped or cringed. They stood their ground, differently, yes, but always with the same purpose, to tell the truth, to sing what was real, to be exactly who they were. George Strait held the line. He guarded the roots of country like a sacred fire, steady, unwavering, and pure. He never changed to fit the charts. He was the chart. He didn't evolve. He endured. And Toby? Toby kicked the damn door open. He stirred controversy. He made noise. He brought new blood into the genre. Fans who had never touched a cowboy hat until Toby made patriotism and pride sound like an anthem. And the message? Loud doesn't mean fake, and fearless doesn't mean foolish. Together, they were country music's paradox, the still water and the wildfire. And yet both men carved out paths that shaped the sound of a generation. You can hear it in the voices of today's stars: Cody Johnson, Chris Stapleton, Parker McCollum, Luke Combs. That blend of grit and soul, that refusal to be molded, that fire in the belly and steel in the spine, that's Toby's edge. That's George's foundation. So what's the lesson in all this? Country music doesn't need to choose. Not between cowboy and outlaw, not between silence and thunder. Because the truth, both roads lead to greatness, as long as the heart behind it is real. And that's why George Strait's tribute to Toby Keith wasn't just about respect. It was about recognition. One legacy looking another in the eye and saying the words that don't come easy to legends like George. You mattered. You moved us. You made it count. This wasn't just a hat tip. It was a salute. When George Strait finally spoke, he didn't come with a script. No polished speech, no grand stage theatrics, because that's never been his way. What he gave us instead? Something real, something raw, something true. His voice was steady, but his words hit like a freight train. You get to a point where you start looking back more than you look ahead, and when you do, you realize how important it is to say what's on your heart while you still can. That line didn't just land, it cut, because it wasn't just about Toby Keith. It was about everything George had carried quietly for years. The grief, the respect, the missed chances, the words he didn't say, until now. But this moment, he didn't let it pass. He honored a fellow Texan, a fellow fighter, a man who stood for something and never backed down. And George didn't read off a teleprompter. He didn't perform for headlines. He simply did what country boys do when the moment calls for it. He tipped his hat, not to the legend the industry celebrated, but to the man George knew, the one who fought through fire and still sang with heart. His words weren't loud, but they rippled across the country music world like thunder on an open plain. Because when George Strait chooses to speak, you listen. And what he said? It wasn't just about saying goodbye. It was about honoring a legacy built on truth, not trends. Strength, not noise. Presence, not performance. It was a reminder that real greatness doesn't beg for attention. It doesn't chase applause. It just keeps showing up through the pain, through the silence, through the years. And now, George has said what needed saying. Not for the cameras, not for the charts, but because Toby Keith earned it. So now we're left with two men, two icons, two legacies that will outlive the spotlight, the charts, and even the music itself. George Strait, the king who ruled in silence. Toby Keith, the rebel who roared with pride. They never chased the same headlines. They never needed to, because their legacies were never built on noise. They were built on truth, on authenticity, on heart. And now, in a moment no one saw coming, those two worlds collided in the most human way possible. Through grief, through respect, and through the quiet power of a man who finally decided to speak. George Strait didn't just honor Toby Keith. He reminded us what matters. That it's never too late to give someone their flowers. That real artists don't need permission to be themselves. And that country music's soul lives in the stories that never made the front page, but changed lives anyway. If this story moved you, if it made you remember why you fell in love with country music in the first place, hit that like button and subscribe. Because this isn't just a tribute video. It's a reminder that behind every legend is a human story worth telling. And we're just getting started.